But the fact that it may be false does not, in Newman's view, mean that we are unjustified in believing it, nor that we should not give it our full confidence, nor that we are obliged to seek further evidence for it than we have readily to hand. Assent to the proposition, in contrast to all those moves, constitutes, he says, and should constitute, part of the ordinary furniture of our mental life, because it comports well with other things we believe, and because deploying it, acting as if it were true, gives us no problems and provides certain advantages. We might, of course, seek evidence for the truth of the claim if it were challenged in a credible manner. If, for instance, someone whose intelligence and sanity we trust were to tell us that she had travelled from London to Paris dry-shod and without getting on a boat. But in default of this, we believe it, have certitude about it, and are justified in both conditions. So that's the first example. Second example, 2b on your handout. Consider the proposition, I shall die. This is another of Newman's own examples. This too, we, or at least almost all of us, assent to, and with certitude. We have no doubt of it. We order our lives around the assumption that it is true, and taking it to be true enters deeply into the sense we have of ourselves. And yet, what are our grounds for it? We know, certainly by report, that everyone who has ever lived has died. Bracket the usual complications about Mary and the dormition and the assumption and so on. And there's the issue about, well, we won't go into there are some exceptions, but let's not worry about those. We know, certainly by report, that everyone, or almost everyone who has ever lived has died. We have perhaps seen some people die, or have good reason to believe that some people we once knew as living are now dead. But none of this is probative. I quote, "Is the prospect of my death in its logical evidence, as that evidence is brought home to me, much more than a high probability?" Close quote. Newman's answer is no. Our certitude as to our own death is not required of us by way of demonstrative proof. There is, for example, no valid syllogism with certainly true premises that has "I shall die" as a conclusion. But again, this does not mean that we are unjustified in having the certitude we have about our own future death. A third example, of a rather different kind, this is 2c on your handout. This one not from Newman, but one that I think he would have liked. Consider the proposition, modus ponens is valid. This, I'm sure, is something you think about every night before you go to sleep. Modus ponens is an argument schema, also known as the principle of material implication. It has the form, if P then Q, P, therefore Q, where P and Q are placeholders that can be filled in with anything you like. For example, if Newman is a saint, then he can properly be implored for intercession. That will be if P then Q. Affirming P, we say Newman is a saint, we anticipate slightly, and therefore Q, Newman can properly be implored for intercession. Now the argument schema is valid, which is to say that Q does follow from the conjoined assertion of if P then Q and P. Also, most people see that it is valid. That is, when faced with the argument schema or some instance of it, most people will say something like, "Oh yeah, that seems right," and will feel certain they are right. Pause for a moment. Contemplate the argument schema. Ask yourself if it seems valid to you. Probably you'll say yes. But suppose you ask yourself for the grounds of your assent to the validity of modus ponens. Certainly, nearly everyone thinks it valid, and the assumption of its validity enters productively into many kinds of reason, both informal and formal. For example, predicate calculus, much mathematics, informal logic, and so on. But the certitude you have about your assent to the proposition might seem to you to require more. This is, after all, something to do with logic, or so it seems. Perhaps we need, then, a proof of its validity. Wouldn't that be a good thing to have? Wouldn't that provide the best possible ground for your assent? Well, in fact, there is no proof of the validity of modus ponens that does not deploy or make use of the very argument schema whose validity it's trying to prove. You'll have to take my word for that, but believe me, it's right. You can't prove it without assuming its validity. This is not a problem. This is a feature of the proposition and its place or function in human reasoning. It's not a fault or a lack. It's not something we should try to fix. It's something that we should try to recognize and see clearly. To think that you should lose certitude about the validity of modus ponens because there turns out to be no proof of it that doesn't already deploy it, that is simply to be confused. It belongs to the nature of the claim that there can be no proof of it of that sort. It follows, interestingly, that if modus ponens doesn't seem valid to you, there is no formal argument that should convince you of its validity. What you need if you're in that situation is therapy. Or, Newman would prefer to say, a decision to rely upon authority, a point that will have further application in a moment. Okay, so far you've got three instances of propositions that have nothing whatsoever to do with the content of Catholic doctrine. They do not belong to Sacra Doctrina, but they are propositions that Newman uses for a certain purpose. So we now need to turn our attention to what that purpose is before we then apply what we've gleaned from this to Catholic doctrine. You're perhaps beginning to see why people often don't read the grammar of the same. But believe me, Newman thought this a fundamentally important book, a book that gave him much to think about for decades. All right, so what's he trying to do here? Turn to 3a on your handout. If we generalize from the instances that we have already examined, the first thing that happens, and this is fundamentally important to Newman, is that the idea that there is a single epistemic calculus is rebutted. Now, what would a single epistemic calculus look like? It would be a mode of demonstrating the truth of any proposition you like that would apply indifferently to every kind of proposition. That would be a single epistemic calculus. So one example might be that in order to be justified in assenting to some claim, you need to have a formally valid demonstrative proof of that claim. And that, if it was a single epistemic calculus, would apply to every claim that you can imagine. What follows from Newman's treatment of the examples we've just looked at, and he treats many more, is that the idea that there should be a single epistemic calculus is itself confused. There is no calculus. Why not? Let's look at 1, 2, and 3 under 3a. 3a1. Claims are of different kinds. The three examples we took are of deeply different kinds of claim. One is an empirical claim about a geographic entity. The second is a claim about your own future. And the third is a claim about the form validity of an argument scheme. The idea that claims of those different kinds should be justifiable in the same way is a confused idea. The truth is, Newman shows abundantly and elegantly, is that claims of different kinds require different patterns of justification. And to think otherwise is to show yourself subject to a fundamental epistemological confusion. What you appeal to in order to justify Great Britain as an island is quite different from what you appeal to in order to justify I shall die. So the idea of a single epistemic calculus is rebutted, one, because claims are of different kinds. But also, 3a2, it's rebutted because knowers, people, are differently catechized and differently situated. That is to say, what seems to a particular person to be true will be different from what seems to another person to be true. Very often irreducibly and inarguably different. I'll come in more detail in a moment to why that is. But the point for the moment is just that in order to justify a particular claim to a particular person, you may have to do something very different than you would to justify that same claim to a different person. Because the cognitive situation and the catechetical preparation of